Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Unit 1 notes for biology class. The topic of this unit is called Characteristics of Life, and in this unit we are going to be exploring some of the defining characteristics that allow things to be called alive and don't allow others to be called alive. And so we're going to investigate some of the common aspects that life has. You'll see that we go beyond um, what maybe we want you to learn and retain for an assessment. So you'll see there's some other things in here that are going to be helpful for you to understand. So at this time, if you haven't already done so, make sure you have something to take Cornell notes on, as that's what you should be doing here during part 1 and then also during part 2, which we'll get to later. All right. So keep in mind, I'm going to go through these kind of fast. My goal is to keep this somewhere around 15 minutes or less. And so if you find that I'm going too quickly, remember I'm going to be giving you this link on YouTube, and you can change the playback speed. You can also pause when necessary. So hopefully you can take advantage of that. So here are some of the objectives we have in our intro units to the core concepts. So we're going to ask that you name and describe at least 5 of what we call the themes of life or characteristics of life. And these characteristics of life are things that apply to all living organisms, right? So there are 7 main ones we'll discuss. We would like you to be able to tell us some details about 5 of them. Beyond that, we're also going to talk about a microscope and how they work and functions of their parts and how to use them properly. It will be interesting. We'll see how the year goes. We may have an opportunity to use them in class, but in all reality, we'll probably be using virtual microscopes. And even though that's the case, you will eventually get back to a real microscope in some science class. So it's important to know how they work so you don't damage those expensive pieces of equipment. But we will start today by talking about some of these characteristics that all life share. Now, please keep in mind that as I said, we're going to go into more detail than you are responsible for on a test. So some of these original or beginning topics aren't necessarily the most important to know in detail, but they are worth knowing some intro bit about. So that's why we talk about them here. Okay, so to get started, what I'd like you to do is after I get done talking here in a second, go ahead and pause the video and try this on your own, right? You could write these down in your notes or just keep them in your head, but do me a favor and try to think of as many of the most common characteristics that all living things have. Try to think of a few of those right now. Okay, so hopefully you're able to come up with some of them. So these next set of notes are, they're not necessarily the 7 themes of life, although many of these are shared among all living things. They are not the textbook examples, if you will, but we find that a lot of students say these when in that moment that I just asked for you to think of these on your own. So just want to talk about those a little bit, get those out of the way, and then we'll get into the 7 themes. So what are those 7 themes of life? Before we get into those other ones, let's talk about, like I said, what's actually going to be on the test. So in no particular order: cell structure and function, metabolism, homeostasis, reproduction, evolution, heredity, and interdependence are the 7 themes of life, or 7 characteristics of life. And these 7 things we'll talk about in some detail in these notes. And as I said, these are what all living things have in common. And so they are what we will focus on. All right. We call these 7 themes HH crime, and you will see me reference that a lot during this year. We will talk a lot about how these apply to all of the other units in many ways. So we want you to know these 7 themes of life, and this little acronym is pretty useful in helping you remember it. So in case it wasn't clear, HH crime stands for the 7 themes in this particular order. So hopefully if you can remember HH crime, you can remember the 7 themes a bit more readily in the future. So here are some of those other topics that we see a lot of students say, even though they're not necessarily the 7 themes of life. So first off, if you're not aware of this, the tissue that makes up living things, right, which is made of cells at a smaller level, is comprised of about 6 elements in some various forms, right? So 99% of life is made of just these 6 things, right? So carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur in different molecules and configurations make up life. And so these are important to remember. We give you another little acronym here to hopefully help you remember it. We call it SHNOPS. I've seen other students who like PONCHS better, PONCHS, whatever works for you. But it's important to, like I said, keep these 6 in mind, especially when we get into some of the biochemistry units or lessons in some of the future units. Next, we talk about what is probably the most common answer I get when I ask students for something that's common to all life. People know that water is essential for living things. The reason, though, may not be as clear to you. So if you're not sure why life needs water, it is because all biochemical reactions occur with or in water, right? So the things that allow life to work, the chemical reactions needed for life, which is what biochemical means, they all need water. Water is a very unique molecule in many ways because of how useful it is in some of the reactions and the properties required for an environment where these reactions can take place. So again, you knew that life needed water, but there is why they need it, and we need it, right? And so, you've also heard in this second bullet point that you and I are about 2/3 water, or mostly water, or a lot of water. Look, that number is controversial. I don't know exactly what it is, and I think it's debatable. But nonetheless, if you look at what you're made of, right, you will definitely find that you have quite a bit of you is made up of just water molecules, right? So that's interesting. Something else that I would call a very common answer is that oftentimes students say, well, everything moves, right? And of course, this is where I would throw back and I'd say, okay, so tell me how a plant moves. And some of you may be able to come up with something, but a lot of students kind of get stuck here. And then we could bring up even some of the more, something like a tree in particular, right? So something that's harder to explain. So instead of thinking about this as movement, what you should know is that all life responds to a stimulus, right? Or to stimuli as a plural. So in class, I ask students, okay, so what's a stimulus? And then I clap really loud. Now, some of you are wearing headphones, I imagine, while listening to this, so I don't want to damage any eardrums or anything. But the reaction that I get when I clap really loud is that some students will jump, right? They will physically move in their seats. And that is something they couldn't control. They just did it naturally without even thinking. That's because they were responding to a stimulus that has been ingrained in their brains. And again, you can imagine some of the reasons why this might be a useful thing to do. But nonetheless, that's an example of what I mean by responding to a stimulus. Some other examples, if you've ever seen spiders in action while they are hunting, next time you see a big spider web, take a look in the corners, especially ones that are attached to some other larger object. That's almost always where the spiders are hiding, because that is the vibration that their prey create when they are struggling to get out of the web is exactly what spiders sense, which is why they're able to use their web so effectively, right? So they have to be on the web to feel that. Another example of a response to a stimulus is one of those weird answers to the question about that I was saying earlier about how everything moves to some extent, right? So if you look at how plants move, you will see that there are 2 different ways in which plant parts respond to some outside stimulus in order to move. So the first one we call phototropism. And this is the phenomenon that explains why trees have leaves that grow with branches in the upwards direction, right? It's because those leaves are seeking sunlight. So we call this phototropism, photo meaning light, because that's the light that is creating the direction of their movement. Okay. The same is true for the roots and the root system of plants, right? Those things typically grow downwards and they are responding to gravity. That is called geotropism. Another example of a response to a stimulus is a bit goofier, right? This is a behavioral response, and definitely not every organism has a complicated way of behaving like the example here, but a lot of living things do have these capabilities, right? So this creature we're talking about is called a killdeer, and it's a type of bird that is native to Ohio, but it has a very unusual response when an invader or predator is coming to its nest, assumingly to eat its eggs. So I wonder if you've ever heard of this, right? But what the killdeer will do is it will fly up somewhat quickly, and then it will drop to the ground and start to flail and kind of violently thrust. And what it's doing is it's mimicking the appearance of a broken wing. And so when this happens, it causes a big commotion. The predator is almost always lured away from the nest. It gets distracted by the flailing adult, and wouldn't you know it, right when that predator is trying to make its final approach to the adult that looks injured, it magically recovers. It flies away unharmed, and it has now successfully lured that predator away from the nest. So talk about a wild turn of events. But again, this is a response to a stimulus. The stimulus here being the fear of their offspring being consumed and dying. And so you can see why they might develop such a habit. We call those adaptations, and we'll get to those later in the notes. Next, all life undergoes what we call a life cycle, right, where they will grow and develop. Please notice that these are two different terms, right? Sometimes people get them confused or mix them up or assume they're the same thing, but growth is definitely different than development, although not completely, I guess. So here we see an example of a life cycle of, again, a butterfly of some type. So you should be familiar with that. That's what I mean by life cycles. Keep in mind, when we witness growth of living things, that can happen one of two ways, right? It can happen by cells getting bigger, right, or enlargement, or we can just add more cells, right? So remember in biology class, division equals multiplication. So when those cells divide, they make more of themselves, again, making the tissue larger and the organism bigger. So if you take a look at these two pictures, right, just in that same sense of growth and development, notice that creatures get bigger as they grow and develop, right? So in class, I would ask you, okay, which one of these pictures show a rabbit that is older, okay, or rabbits that are older? And the answer is the one on the right, because they are bigger. Again, just showing you how growth and development life cycles typically add weight as life goes on. So with those now being discussed, we're now going to focus on those 7 themes of life that we listed in H.H. Crime. Please remember that this is just part 1 of the notes, so I won't get through all of them, but we will get started at least covering these very important characteristics that all life share. So the first one is one that I'm sure you've heard before. All life is made up of 1 or more cells. Keep in mind that organisms can be multicellular, like you and me, or they can be unicellular, which actually outnumber multicellular creatures by quite a bit, right? We're talking about those small bacteria and other creatures that are made of only 1 cell when we're referring to unicellular creatures. Some other terms and maybe concepts to be a little bit aware of as we go and talk about cell structure and function. So we talked about unicellular, multicellular. Prokaryotic is another term that I hope you've heard before, but if not, prokaryotes are cells that do not have a nucleus or membrane-bound organelles. So for example, every bacteria is a prokaryotic cell, meaning that it does not have a nucleus. Okay, so no nucleus in prokaryotic cells. They are much simpler than eukaryotic cells. That's because eukaryotes, which is our next one, these are cells with a nucleus, and they also have membrane-bound organelles. And so any other creature that's not a bacteria, many others, right? There are other single-celled creatures out there, but many other things are eukaryotic, which means that they have a nucleus in their cells, right? And we're talking about all cells, or at least 99% of them. So with that being said, right, like you guys have heard of cells before, but I wonder if you've ever really got into what they're actually made of. So the 2 main things we can clarify here at the beginning is that cells are made of elements and really molecules of those elements. And specifically in the molecules, we're talking about macromolecules. So we finish our discussion here in part 1 by looking at some of these macromolecules and what they are made of. So we'll come back to that, but just keep in mind that that's what cells are made of. So The next of the major topics we want to talk about is something called metabolism. Metabolism is this concept that life shares because all living things have to use energy to maintain their normal life functions. Examples here are there are two kind of main categories of metabolisms. We have autotrophs or autotrophic creatures. These are things that are able to produce their own food from the energy. They're able to harness the energy from the sun, or sometimes chemicals. We call those chemosynthesis reactions, but we'll get into that later. But those are called autotrophs, and then things like you and I that have to eat, where we have to intake our food from another source, we are called heterotrophic. But both of these demonstrate a type of metabolism, which all life has, right? Things have to get energy, and they have to use that energy to do stuff. So again, going back to the macromolecules, and many of you will notice that we tie this in with metabolism as well as cells because, again, think about it. This is stuff that's found in the food that you eat. Okay, so macromolecules are words that I know you've heard before, at least most of them, right? So carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. Now, folks, we're going to go into a lot more detail about these four things in a future unit, but I just wanted to introduce you to some of the basics of each group because you will hear about them quite a bit. So carbohydrates are made of three elements, right? They are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And different carbohydrates are stacked in a specific ratio. And so, for example, that ratio is 1 to 2 to 1, right, in the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen order. So what that means is for every atom of carbon and oxygen, there are 2 atoms of hydrogen. A very popular example of a carbohydrate is glucose, which is a type of sugar that your body uses to create energy from. And the chemical formula for glucose is C6H12O6. So again, 1 to 2 to 1. And as I said, carbohydrates are the major source of quick energy for cells, but we'll talk more about that later. Lipids are also made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. They don't have a predictable format like the carbohydrates, but they are made of the same stuff, which does kind of talk about how those two are related. Keep in mind, lipids include fats, which are one of our primary sources of long-term energy storage in the body. We've got phospholipids, which make up things like the cell membrane, and we've also got waxes, things that repel water, much like the stuff that, like a candle we've made of. Notice what makes carbohydrates and lipids different is how the elements are arranged. Even though they're made of the same stuff, they are arranged differently. So the way that they are arranged definitely matters. Proteins are comprised of those same 3 elements, but we also added nitrogen. Keep in mind, protein synthesis is an entire unit in this class, so we will get into this in heavy detail. But right now, what I can tell you is that proteins are simply combinations of 20 different amino acids that are found on Earth and seemingly in the universe, as far as we know. Different examples of proteins include structural proteins. Antibodies are examples of proteins. Enzymes, if you've ever heard of an enzyme before, these are things that jumpstart and increase speeds of biochemical reactions. Again, we'll go into that a lot more later, but those are proteins as well. Okay. Finally, we have nucleic acids. Nucleic acids use the 4 elements previously mentioned in proteins, but now we bring in element 5, which is phosphorus. Okay. So those 4 elements in very particular orders, but again, nothing that's neat enough to talk about in a formula, make up the things like DNA, right? DNA is the nucleic acid you're much more familiar with. This year, you will become quite familiar with RNA. It's a very important chemical cousin, if you will, of DNA. But those things are made of those 5 elements. All right, so thank you for paying attention. This ends part 1 of the video. Tune back in next class for part 2, where we finish up the 7 themes of life. Thanks so much.